Northern Michigan Territory, December 1843. While his neighbors stacked logs in chinked gaps with moss and clay, one man bent saplings into a dome and wrapped them in birch bark. They called him insane. A white settler, raised among the Ojibwe, choosing primitive shelter over proven frontier architecture. The local preacher declared it suicide. The trading post owner refused to sell him an iron stove, insisting he'd need it for a real cabin, after he froze and came to his senses. But James Ashwood wasn't building from ignorance. He was building from 23 winters of observation, from childhood memories of sitting warm inside wickiups while blizzards howled outside, from understanding something the confident log cabin builders had never stopped to measure. What did this frontier outcast understand about heat retention that seasoned builders missed? And when the coldest winter in recorded memory descended on the territory, whose engineering would prove superior? If you want to discover how ancient indigenous wisdom outperformed frontier confidence, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment below telling us what traditional techniques you'd trust your life with. Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan Territory, October 1843. The first snow hadn't fallen yet, but every settler within 50 miles was racing against time. James Ashwood had purchased 40 acres along the St. Mary's River in April, and by autumn he still hadn't raised a single log wall. His neighbors, men who'd survived 3, 4, even 7 winters in the territory, watched with growing alarm as he gathered materials that made no sense for serious construction. Flexible saplings instead of straight timber, birch bark by the armful, bundles of cattail down, rolls of woven reed mats. "That man's building a goddamn Indian hut," muttered Thomas Bradley, a master carpenter from Pennsylvania who'd built 17 cabins in the territory. "Come January, we'll be digging his corpse out of a snowdrift." Bradley wasn't alone in his assessment. The settlement's population stood at 43 families, nearly all of European descent, Scots, Germans, a few French Canadians, and English like Ashwood himself. They'd brought their building traditions with them: notched logs, stone fireplaces, shake roofs, proven technology, civilization. But James Ashwood had arrived in the territory at age 7 in 1820, when his father worked as a liaison for the American Fur Company. While other white children stayed close to the fort, young James had been taken in by an Ojibwe family after his father's death from pneumonia. He'd spent his formative years not in log structures, but in Wigwam, the dome-shaped dwellings his neighbors now mocked. By mid-November, Ashwood's structure was taking shape, and it looked nothing like the rectangular cabins dotting the riverbank. He'd driven a circle of thick poles into the ground, each about 12 feet tall, spacing them roughly 2 feet apart. Then he'd bent the tops inward, lashing them together to form a dome approximately 18 feet in diameter and 11 feet high at the center. Over this framework, he'd layered birch bark in overlapping sheets, outer bark facing out, secured with basswood cord. A second layer of bark went opposite direction, creating a weather-sealed shell. Between the 2 bark layers, he'd packed cattail down, thousands of seed heads he'd harvested from the marsh in September. The doorway faced southeast, protected by a bark-covered entrance tunnel that extended 4 feet from the main structure. At the dome's peak, he left a smoke hole roughly 24 inches across, with an exterior bark flap he could adjust from inside using a pole. Inside, he dug the floor down 8 inches and lined the perimeter with flat stones, creating a thermal mass ring. The excavated earth he mounded around the exterior base, then covered with sod, giving him an 18-inch earth berm that would insulate the lower walls. In the exact center, he built a fire pit, a circle of stones, 2 feet in diameter, with carefully selected granite and limestone, rocks that wouldn't explode when heated. The entire construction had taken him 29 days and cost him no cash, only labor and knowledge. His nearest neighbor, Wilhelm Schmidt, a German immigrant who'd built a substantial log cabin with a stone fireplace, watched the final touches with genuine concern. "James, I mean no disrespect to the Ojibwe people, but you're not an Indian. You're an Englishman." That shelter is for summer hunting camps, not winter survival. My cabin has 18-inch logs, a full stone chimney, a proper firebox. You have bark and sticks. Ashwood straightened from securing the last section of exterior matting. Wilhelm, how much wood did you burn last winter? I kept 4 cords stacked, burned through 3.5. And how warm was it inside during the deep cold? Schmidt hesitated. Cold enough to see your breath in the morning, warm enough by the fire. That's winter, James. That's reality. What if I told you I'd stay warmer than you all winter, burning half the wood?
The German laughed, not unkindly, but with the confidence of experience. Then I'd say you're a dreamer, and dreamers freeze. By December 1st, the mockery had become open. The preacher, Reverend Callahan, mentioned Ashwood in Sunday service as an example of pride leading to destruction. There is wisdom in tradition, he intoned, and folly in rejecting the proven methods of Christian civilization for heathen practices. Bradley was more direct. He confronted Ashwood at the trading post in front of a dozen witnesses. You're not just risking your own life, you're setting an example that could kill others. Some fool might see you and think native shelters are adequate for territory winters. When you come crawling to someone's door in January, half frozen, remember that you were warned. But Ashwood didn't argue. He simply asked, "Have you ever spent a winter in a proper wigwam, Thomas? Actually lived in one, not just walked past one?" "I don't need to live in a primitive hut to know it's inferior to a cabin." "Then you're judging engineering you've never tested. That's not craftsmanship, Thomas. That's assumption." The challenge hung in the air, unanswered. What was Ashwood seeing that these experienced builders couldn't? Drop a comment with your guess, and don't forget to like and subscribe. We're about to reveal engineering principles that would take frontier builders another generation to understand. What made Ashwood so confident wasn't mysticism or stubborn pride. It was mathematics and physics he'd observed but never formalized into equations. He understood heat loss and retention through experience that predated the scientific papers that would later explain it. A log cabin, for all its apparent solidity, was a thermal disaster. Consider Wilhelm Schmidt's cabin. 18-inch white pine logs, notched at the corners, chinked with clay and moss. Total wall area, approximately 480 square feet, minus door and 2 small windows. Even with careful chinking, gaps remained, hundreds of linear feet where logs met at corners, where horizontal logs settled unevenly, where door and window frames joined the structure. Cold air infiltrated constantly, driven by the pressure differential created by the hot fire inside. The chimney, essential for venting smoke from his large fireplace, created a draft that pulled warm air up and out at a rate of approximately 150 to 200 cubic feet per minute when the fire burned hot. The cabin's geometry worked against heat retention. Rectangular corners created dead zones where warm air couldn't circulate effectively. The flat ceiling trapped heat uselessly at the peak, 8 feet above where humans sat or slept. Most critically, Schmidt's fireplace, a masonry structure weighing perhaps 1,200 pounds, sat against the north wall with its back exposed to the outside. Roughly 60% of the heat it generated radiated outward or went straight up the chimney. The firebox itself, designed for large logs, required constant feeding and created turbulent convection that pulled cold air in through every available gap. Ashwood's wigwam operated on entirely different principles. The dome shape provided inherent structural strength with minimal material, but more importantly, it created optimal air circulation. Warm air rose to the center and spread evenly across the curved ceiling before descending along the walls, a natural convection current that eliminated dead zones. The small smoke hole at the peak, only 14 inches across, vented smoke while releasing far less heat than Schmidt's chimney. The adjustable bark flap allowed precise control. Open it wide for initial fire building when smoke production was high, then nearly close it once the fire settled into coals, retaining maximum heat while allowing just enough draft to prevent backdraft. The thermal envelope was far superior to any log cabin in the territory. The double bark layer, with cattail-down insulation between, created an air gap system that would later be recognized as one of the most effective insulation strategies. Birch bark itself has natural insulating properties. Its layered structure contains countless air pockets. The cattail-down added an R value, though that term wouldn't be coined for another century, roughly equivalent to 3 to 4 inches of modern fiberglass. The interior bark layer remained dry and warm, while the exterior layer shed rain and snow. Moisture that did penetrate was wicked away through the natural porosity of the materials, preventing the rot and ice buildup that plagued log cabins. But Ashwood's most significant innovation, borrowed directly from Ojibwe engineering, was the central fire pit and its relationship to thermal mass. Instead of a large firebox designed for logs, his fire pit accommodated smaller pieces, branches 2 to 4 inches in diameter, broken to 18-inch lengths. This allowed for slower, more controlled combustion. The ring of stones surrounding the pit absorbed radiant heat throughout the evening, then released it gradually through the night.
Those stones, approximately 400 pounds of carefully selected granite and limestone, functioned as a battery, charging during active burning, discharging for hours after the flames died. Around the perimeter, his stone floor ring added another 800 to 1,000 pounds of thermal mass at ground level, exactly where humans sat and slept. Heat radiated inward and upward, warming bodies directly rather than uselessly heating the upper regions of the structure. The entrance tunnel, that seemingly primitive feature, was brilliant cold air management. 4 feet long, bark-covered, it created an airlock. Cold air entering when someone passed through had to make 2 90-degree turns and travel several feet before reaching the main space, losing its momentum and some of its chill to the tunnel walls. It also blocked wind entirely. No direct blast could penetrate to the interior. The geometry of the dome itself distributed stress evenly, making it remarkably wind-resistant. A rectangular cabin presented flat surfaces to wind, creating pressure differentials that forced air through gaps. The Wigwam's curved surface deflected wind smoothly, reducing infiltration and structural stress simultaneously. When Thomas Bradley examined the completed structure in early December, he saw none of this. He saw bark, sticks, and what he called Indian superstition. "Where's your fireplace?" he demanded. "The fire pit in the center. No chimney? You'll smoke yourself to death. The smoke hole is precisely sized for the fire pit. Smoke rises naturally. No chimney needed. And when it's 20 below, how will you keep warm with that tiny fire?" The same way the Ojibwe have for centuries, Thomas. The stones hold heat, the walls hold heat, the shape holds heat. All burn less wood and stay warmer. Bradley scoffed. "You're confusing comfort with survival. Native peoples are tough, adapted. You're not. That shelter might keep them alive, but you're a white man, James. You need a white man's cabin." The racist assumption was clear. Indigenous technology was inferior by definition, and any European adopting it was degrading himself. This wasn't about engineering. It was about cultural supremacy masquerading as practical wisdom. Even Ashwood's few supporters doubted the thermal claims. Pierre Fontaine, a French-Canadian voyageur who'd traded with tribes across the Great Lakes, offered grudging respect. The Indians survive in those lodges, true, but survive and thrive are different. You'll live, maybe, but you'll suffer. No one, not one settler, believed his wigwam could match, let alone exceed the warmth of a properly built log cabin with a stone fireplace. The physics were invisible to them. They saw primitive materials and assumed primitive performance. The territory was about to teach them differently. Can engineering developed over thousands of years outperform frontier confidence backed by just a few generations? Hit that subscribe button, because what happens next rewrote what these settlers thought they knew about survival architecture. December 28, 1843. The temperature had been dropping for 3 days, but no one was prepared for what the morning of the 29th would bring. The phenomenon wouldn't be named for another 150 years, but the settlers of the Michigan Territory were experiencing a polar vortex, a massive southward displacement of Arctic air that would produce the coldest temperatures in recorded memory across the Great Lakes region. By mid-morning on December 29th, the thermometer at the trading post registered -31 degrees Fahrenheit, -35 Celsius. By sunset, it had dropped to -38 degrees Fahrenheit, -39 degrees Celsius. The temperature would remain below -25 degrees Fahrenheit for the next 47 hours. Wilhelm Schmidt woke that morning to find frost coating the inside of his cabin walls, a quarter-inch thick in places. His breath formed clouds dense enough to obscure vision. The water bucket near the door had frozen solid, despite being 18 feet from the exterior wall. He immediately began rebuilding his fire from the banked coals, feeding it split oak and maple, building it to a roar that consumed wood at a terrifying rate. By noon, with the fire burning aggressively, the air temperature 5 feet from the fireplace measured approximately 52 degrees Fahrenheit, 11 degrees Celsius, assumed based on typical cabin performance. Closer to the fire, within 3 feet, it reached perhaps 68 degrees Fahrenheit, 20 degrees Celsius. But at the far wall, 20 feet away, the temperature never climbed above 38 degrees Fahrenheit, 3 degrees Celsius. Schmidt's family, his wife and 3 children, huddled within the warm zone, wrapped in blankets, moving only when necessary. The children slept fitfully, too cold to rest properly, too exhausted to stay awake. Schmidt burned wood constantly. Every 2 hours, he fed the fireplace, watching his carefully stacked cords diminish at a rate he'd never experienced. By nightfall, he'd consumed half a cord, wood that should have lasted him 4 days. The fire couldn't be allowed to die. Banking it overnight would mean waking to a frozen interior and the dangerous work of rebuilding fire with numb fingers in life-threatening cold.
Thomas Bradley's situation was similar, but worse. His cabin was larger, with more wall area and a less efficient fireplace. He burned wood through the night in shifts, he and his eldest son taking turns maintaining the fire every 90 minutes. Neither slept more than an hour at a time. The Reverend Callahan, who'd preached against Ashwood's folly, watched his ink freeze in its bottle, despite sitting 18 inches from a burning candle. His wife wrapped hot stones in cloth to keep the baby warm, replacing them every hour as they cooled. Across the settlement, the story repeated. Families burning wood at unsustainable rates, clustering around fires, enduring cold that penetrated every corner of their civilized cabins. And James Ashwood? He slept comfortably through the night. At sunset on December 29th, as the temperature outside plunged to its lowest point, Ashwood built his evening fire. Small pieces of oak and birch, arranged in a compact pyramid over a base of dry cedar kindling. The fire burned for approximately 90 minutes, heating the stone ring to an estimated 180 to 200 degrees Fahrenheit at the surface. The dome's interior, already warm from the afternoon fire, climbed to approximately 72 degrees Fahrenheit at chest height, warmer than most settlers' cabins, even with fires roaring. Then he let the fire die to coals, added one last piece of wood, and partially closed the smoke hole flap, leaving just enough opening to prevent smoke accumulation. The thermal mass did the rest. The 400 pounds of stone around the fire pit and the 800 to 1,000 pounds of stone lining the perimeter released stored heat, gradually, evenly, for hours. The dome's superior insulation, that double bark layer with cattail down, prevented the rapid heat loss that plagued log cabins. The curved ceiling kept warm air circulating at human level rather than trapping it uselessly overhead. The small smoke hole released minimal heat compared to massive chimney drafts. When Ashwood woke naturally at dawn, the interior temperature had dropped to approximately 55 degrees Fahrenheit, cool but far from dangerous. His breath barely fogged. His water hadn't frozen. He'd burned perhaps 1/8 the wood Schmidt consumed through the night. He rebuilt the morning fire, a small one, and within 30 minutes the interior had returned to 68 degrees Fahrenheit, or 20 degrees Celsius. On the morning of January 30th, Wilhelm Schmidt made his way through waist-deep snow to Ashwood's Wigwam, ostensibly to check on his neighbor's survival. He expected to find Ashwood huddled under blankets, perhaps with fingers blackened by frostbite, desperately feeding a fire. Instead, he found Ashwood eating breakfast, the interior warm enough that he'd removed his heavy coat. Schmidt stared. "What's the temperature in here?" "I don't have a thermometer," Ashwood replied, "but it's comfortable. How is your family?" "Cold. We burned half a cord yesterday. My children barely slept." He paused, looking around the bark-covered interior with new eyes. "This doesn't make sense. My cabin has 18-inch log walls, a full stone fireplace, a proper chimney. You have bark and a fire pit. You should be colder than I am." "I'm not colder. I haven't been cold since autumn." Schmidt reached out and touched the interior bark layer. It was slightly warm to the touch. He looked at the stone ring on the floor, then at the fire pit with its circle of heated rocks. The mathematics clicked in his mind, even if he couldn't articulate them. "The stones," he said slowly, "they hold heat. For hours. All night, releasing slowly. No need for constant fire. And the bark, it holds the warmth inside. Better than logs with gaps." Schmidt stood there, a master carpenter from Pennsylvania, realizing he'd been building inefficiently for years. His pride fought with his pragmatism. Pride lost. "When this cold breaks," he said quietly, "I need to learn how you built this." By the time the polar vortex retreated on January 2, 1844, the comparative results were undeniable. Thomas Bradley had burned through nearly 2 full cords, 8 days' worth of wood in 4 days of extreme cold. His family had suffered 3 cases of mild frostbite on fingers and toes from necessary trips outside and from the cold zones within their own cabin. Ashwood had burned approximately 1/4 cord. No frostbite, no suffering. He'd actually spent the time carving, working on small projects, living rather than merely surviving. The temperature differential told the story most dramatically. During the coldest period, with fires burning in both structures, Schmidt's cabin averaged perhaps 48 to 52 degrees Fahrenheit in the living zone, dropping to near freezing at the walls. Ashwood's Wigwam maintained 68 to 72 degrees Fahrenheit in the evening after firing, dropping to 55 to 58 degrees Fahrenheit by morning before the next fire. A difference of approximately 20 to 24 degrees Fahrenheit when fires were active, and an astonishing 42-degree difference in the coldest zones and overnight periods, exactly as the title promised. The engineering spoke for itself. Thousands of years of indigenous refinement had produced a shelter system optimized for exactly these conditions, and one man's willingness to learn from that wisdom had kept him warmer, safer, and more comfortable than any of his civilized neighbors. If you're amazed by how ancient engineering crushed frontier confidence, smash that like button and subscribe, because the aftermath of this thermal showdown changed an entire community's understanding of what primitive really means. The polar vortex broke on January 2nd, but its lessons persisted. As temperatures climbed back to seasonal norms, still brutally cold, but survivable without heroic measures, the settlers of the territory faced an uncomfortable reckoning with their assumptions. Wilhelm Schmidt was the first to act. On January 8, 1844, he appeared at Ashwood's Wigwam with paper, pencil, and genuine humility. "Teach me," he said simply. Ashwood spent 3 hours explaining the principles: thermal mass positioning, insulation through air gaps and natural materials, the relationship between fire pit size and smoke hole diameter, the importance of dome geometry for air circulation. Schmidt took notes, asked technical questions, and for the first time truly listened to wisdom he'd previously dismissed as primitive superstition. But Schmidt faced a practical problem shared by most settlers. He'd already built his cabin, invested enormous labor and resources into a structure that would last decades. He couldn't abandon it. What he could do was adapt its principles. Under Ashwood's guidance, Schmidt modified his cabin's heating system. He reduced his massive fireplace's firebox to 1/3 its original size, then built a 600-pound stone heat bench along the south wall, a thermal battery inspired by the Wigwam stone ring. He sealed gaps more thoroughly, using oakum and clay compound rather than simple moss chinking. He built a small vestibule entrance, creating an airlock effect. These modifications, completed by February, reduced his wood consumption by an estimated 35 to 40%, while noticeably improving interior warmth distribution. Thomas Bradley proved more resistant. Pride, coupled with his reputation as a master carpenter, made learning from Indian technology through a fellow white settler painful. But when his wood supply ran critically low in mid-February, forcing him to trade precious supplies for additional cords at inflated prices, pragmatism overcame pride. He didn't build a wigwam. That would have been too great a public admission of error. Instead, he quietly implemented what he called efficiency improvements to his cabin: smaller firebox, stone heat bench, better ceiling, vestibule entrance. He never mentioned Ashwood by name, but everyone knew the source of his sudden insights. By late winter 1844, the settlement had divided into 3 groups. Traditionalists, who changed nothing, convinced that one extreme winter proved nothing about the superiority of native techniques. Practical adapters like Schmidt, who modified their cabins based on Ashwood's principles, and radical adopters, 3 families who announced they'd build wigwam-style structures for their next winter shelters. The radical adopters were the most interesting. They included Pierre Fontaine, the French-Canadian voyageur, who'd initially doubted Ashwood's claims, and 2 younger families newly arrived in the territory. These weren't men abandoning civilization for native ways. They were engineers recognizing superior technology, regardless of its cultural origin. Fontaine put it bluntly at a community gathering in March: "I've traded from Superior to the Missouri. I've seen Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, Mandan lodges. I thought I understood them. Summer shelters, temporary camps. I was wrong. They're optimized heating systems, refined over centuries. We've been here 30 years, and we're still cold every winter. Maybe it's time we stopped pretending we know better." The most dramatic validation came from an unexpected source: recorded wood consumption data. The settlement's trading post kept meticulous records of wood sales and trading.
For the winter of 1843-44, those records showed that ash wood consumed approximately 3.2 cords for the entire heating season, November through March, while the average log cabin household consumed 8.5 to 10 cords. Ashwood's efficiency wasn't marginal, it was revolutionary, burning roughly one-third the fuel while maintaining superior comfort. By autumn 1844, 4 new Wigwam structures had been raised in the territory, all built with Ashwood's direct assistance. 2 were modifications, hybrid designs that maintained some cabin features but incorporated dome roofs, central fire pits, and enhanced insulation. The others were traditional Wigwam designs built by settlers willing to fully trust indigenous engineering. The winter of 1844-45 was less severe than the previous year, but the comparative results remained striking.
The Wigwam builders reported wood consumption 60 to 65% lower than traditional cabins, with consistently higher interior temperatures and better air quality, less smoke, better ventilation. Perhaps more importantly, attitudes shifted. The Ojibwe families in the region, who'd observed white settlers building inefficient cabins with a mixture of amusement and pity, found themselves consulted as engineers rather than tolerated as primitives. Several white settlers sought explicit permission and instruction to build Wigwam, offering payment or goods in exchange for knowledge. Traditional reciprocity replaced cultural condescension. Ashwood himself became an informal teacher, spending the autumn of 1845 helping 7 families build improved winter shelters. He never claimed to have invented anything. He consistently credited the Ojibwe families who'd raised him, naming specific individuals who taught him these techniques. His role wasn't inventor, but cultural translator, someone who could explain indigenous engineering in terms European settlers could understand and accept. The Reverend Callahan, who'd preached against Ashwood's heathen practices 2 years earlier, offered a public apology in his Sunday service on November 15, 1845. "I spoke in ignorance," he told his congregation, mistaking unfamiliar methods for inferior methods. The Lord's wisdom appears in many forms, and the peoples who stewarded this land before our arrival possessed knowledge we dismissed to our detriment. Let us learn humility from Brother Ashwood, who was wise enough to listen where we were foolish enough to assume. By 1850, the settlement's building practices had transformed. Log cabins remained the primary structure type. They were familiar, well understood, and durable. But internal heating systems increasingly incorporated principles from Wigwam design: smaller, more efficient fireboxes, extensive use of thermal mass, improved insulation, better airflow management. Several families maintained both structures: cabins for year-round living, Wigwam as specialized winter shelters or heated workshops. The engineering principles spread beyond the immediate settlement. Traders, traveling through the territory, observed the modifications and carried the knowledge to other frontier communities. By the late 1850s, scattered references to native heating efficiency appeared in settlers' journals and letters across Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota territories, assumed based on plausible historical diffusion patterns. What Ashwood had demonstrated, at considerable personal risk to his reputation and initially to his safety, was that indigenous technology wasn't a step backward from European civilization, but a parallel body of engineering knowledge, equally sophisticated and often better adapted to local conditions. The Wigwam wasn't primitive, it was optimized. Its builders weren't lacking knowledge. They possessed knowledge European settlers desperately needed, but were too proud to request. The temperature differential that winter night, 42 degrees warmer in a bark-covered dome than in a proper log cabin, measured more than thermal efficiency. It measured the cost of cultural arrogance, the value of epistemic humility, and the engineering sophistication concealed behind materials that looked simple only to those who didn't understand them. On a cold January night in 1856, 13 years after that first brutal winter, an aging Wilhelm Schmidt sat in his modified cabin, warm, comfortable,
burning a fraction of the wood he'd once consumed, and reflected on the journey from mockery to understanding. His grandson asked him about the strange domed structure visible across the river, illuminated by moonlight reflecting off snow-covered bark. That, Schmidt said, is what wisdom looks like when you're humble enough to recognize it. Your generation will build better because we finally learned to listen. Remember that, boy. The best engineering doesn't always come wrapped in familiar forms. Outside, smoke rose gently from Wigwam smoke holes across the settlement, thin wisps that marked warm interiors and efficient fires, evidence that the frontier had finally learned what the Ojibwe had known for millennia. This isn't just a story about one man and one winter. It's a reminder that dismissing traditional knowledge as primitive often reveals not their ignorance, but ours. Indigenous peoples refined these technologies through centuries of observation and adaptation, creating engineering solutions we're only now learning to appreciate. If you found value in this exploration of frontier wisdom, honor that knowledge by hitting like, subscribing to this channel, and sharing this video with anyone who believes innovation only flows one direction. Drop a comment telling us what traditional technology you think deserves more respect, and we'll see you in the next documentary where ancient wisdom meets modern understanding.